Okay, hopefully everyone can see my slides. I'm sharing them. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for your time and being here tonight. I'm missing everybody's face in class, so it's great to see everybody here today. And I'm very excited to present our Capstone project, and it is a review of environmental education programs at botanic gardens across New York City. If you don't know who I am, my name is Carolina Selene. I'm an MS candidate in the Urban Sustainability Program at City College. And some of my interests that brought me to pursue this research project is my motivation to build more resilient communities. And I feel that we can do this through connecting people with their local green spaces and increasing environmental education for children. And I'm going to pass it off to my capstone partner to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, for those of you who don't know me, I am Navita Ruksha-Vignoles, and I'm also an Urban Sustainability MS candidate here at CCNY. And I've always been interested in botanic institutions, non-traditional education, as well as children's education, and I think it's very important that we educate our upcoming generations with the climate change knowledge they need in order to combat the issues they will be facing in their lifetimes.
So I think we're all aware of the existential threat that climate change poses, especially on the younger generations that may inherit an Earth that's been through irreversible damage. And one solution to mitigating these climate change threats is to develop a citizenry that's involved in stewardship. So ones that are protecting their local green spaces and managing them. And in order to produce stewards of the earth, we need to connect people with nature. So studies have shown that that is the most effective way to produce stewards.
In a rapidly urbanizing world, I think currently we have maybe 60% of the world's population living in cities. And we all know, living in cities at one point in our lives, that green spaces are really hard to come by. And it's very important to provide children green spaces where they can form these connections with nature and stewardship thinking skills. And botanic institutions provide this space and a support system through which these children and people are able to learn about the flora of the world and ecology.
So building one benefit of connections to nature is building stewards, but there's also immense benefits for children. So children that are connected to nature have a stronger environmental awareness, which will lead to positive impacts on their cognitive, motor, and social development skills.
In our literature review, 3 pedagogies were implemented by the botanic institutions, and they were place-based learning, hands-on interactions, and inquiry-based learning. And throughout this presentation, we will take a closer look at these being implemented at botanic institutions across New York City.
So from our literature review, we found that motivations that are listed in a mission statement of an organization will influence all aspects of an organization. And also the resources that an organization has will affect the structure. So we were using these points as a basis for our framework and what we would expect to see in botanical organizations. And here on the next slide, we have a visualization of what that looks like. So a mission is going to state the values and the resource allocation of an organization. And along with funding, those will all affect the educational programming, specifically these components listed here. And we chose to apply that framework to 3 different botanical gardens in New York City. And we worked to analyze them by interviewing 5 different education program directors. So we had interviewed 3 from New York Botanical Garden, 1 at each the Brooklyn Botanic Garden and the Queens Botanic Garden. And from our interview answers, we had discovered these 6 emergent themes, which we will talk about.
So here displayed, we have the mission statements of these institutions, as well as just a little bit of tidbits on them, but don't focus too much on the mission statements. We will be coming back and visiting them throughout our presentation. But the takeaway from this is the New York Botanic Garden is the largest, oldest, and best funded institution of all three, followed by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and then followed by the Queens Botanic Garden.
So we had designed 17 interview questions. They were informed by our literature review and our theoretical framework, and they were split up into these 3 different categories. So an introduction to program and resources, environmental education at the institution, and then the assessments that were in place for these environmental programs. And like I had said before, from our interview answers, 6 emergent themes came about. And the main goal of our paper was really to get a holistic view of the botanic institutions.
The first thing we took a look at was the publicly accessible mission statements of these 3 botanic institutions. And the takeaway from this is the New York Botanic Garden was the only one to have a global focus. And displayed in our table here, we can see that in our table on the next slide, we see that while New York Botanic Garden is the only one with a global goal, all 3 institutions focus on local goals.
And so those local goals were echoed in the interviews that we had done. So we have this quote here from Brooklyn Botanic Garden that represents that when they say, one of the key things about our garden was that it was always civic centered. It was meant to serve the people of Brooklyn, intended to serve the community, an institution where horticulture, science, and education all came together to reflect the needs of the public around us. And we see that mirrored in their mission statement when they say that the Brooklyn Botanic Garden is an urban botanic garden that connects people to the world of plants, fostering delight and curiosity while inspiring an appreciation and sense of stewardship of the environment. And again, in Queens Botanic Garden's interview, they also had emphasized their local community connection when they say that it was very much so intertwined in our mission statement that what we're doing in the education department, bringing people to the garden, celebrating everybody, just allowing different people to be together in a public garden. This was also something that was reflected in their mission statement when they had said that they were an urban oasis where cultures are celebrated.
In addition, there were learning goals that emerged from our interviews, and within those, there were 2 different goals that emerged across the board. And they were what happens when people visit the gardens and what happens when they leave the gardens. And for that second one, there were 2 subcategories. And the gardens focused on building nature connections between nature and people, as well as skills within their patrons.
So again, in our interviews, what we had seen highlighted by the New York Botanic Garden was an emphasis on these learning experiences. So New York Botanic Garden had said, teaching children to learn outdoors, or rather designing learning experiences for children that help them learn outdoors in the best ways that humans learn, versus telling students and having these tours by people who have lots of information and tell children lots of information. And then in this quote by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we see their emphasis for the skills that the child will take home. So that relationship to the plant is very important. I think that ownership, that idea of stewardship, the idea that I can take care of this living thing, this is something I can do because plants are so important to the planet. And interestingly, this is explicitly said in their mission statement when they say that they inspire an appreciation and a sense of stewardship of the environment. And very interestingly, across all of the mission statements of all institutions, stewardship is mentioned. In New York Botanical Garden, they say, educating, training, and empowering the next generation of Earth caregivers. And for Queens Botanic Garden, explicitly saying real-world applications of environmental stewardship is one of their motivations.
In addition, we had asked them what makes them distinct within the offerings for children in New York City. And these are what they had responded. And in this quote by the Queens Botanic Garden, it really shows what they value the most across the board. They value inquiry-based immersive learning, and they say asking questions as you go and looking at trends. is what the Queens Botanic Garden likes to focus on. And in addition, this is super interesting. Every single botanic garden across the board agreed on the content learned by the program participants. And they had a serious emphasis on being DOE partners. And this is reflected in a quote by the NYBG, where they state, "They're definitely connected to the city and state standards because 25,000 school kids are coming through just that one institution in 1 year. And I bet you this is an outdated number." In addition, we asked, what does hands-on learning mean to the institution? And as we see, there was a multitude of answers. Learning by doing was said by the QBG. Physical immersion by the New York Botanic Garden. Touching the plant collection that Brooklyn Botanic Garden has available for their children. Agency over their bodies by another person at the New York Botanic Garden. And finally, being an active participant in the programs by the Queens Botanic Garden. Across the board, they all agreed on focusing on program success measurements in an alternative methodology. These institutions recognize that surveying is a valuable method of program success, as stated here by the BBG. One of the most important things we can do as a botanic garden is allowing ourselves with universities, us, to have graduate students do research on program efficacies. A lot of funding is dependent on what you can show on your successes. And as you can see, Brooklyn and Queens Botanic Garden lack this. But as an alternative methodology, they use a lot of non-traditional ways of collecting information on whether or not they're successful, and reflected by the New York Botanic Garden is this quote. They say, "They have a bunch of staff here who I met when they were 4 years old. To see them all grow up and share programs that they have been participants of is pretty powerful and a good sign of the fact that we've done something to someone's life to make them want to teach even more people about something you care about." And finally, we had asked them the changes they would make to their programming given unlimited funding. And as we see here, that everyone said they would increase programming, while the New York Botanic Garden also said they would increase multi-trip programming as well as increase the full-time staff that they have. And reflected here may be a reason as to why. They say, "I feel pretty horrible saying that we are spoiled here. We have been. This project we just spent 28 million of other people's money on, so it kind of feels like resources are unlimited for us right now. We'll say that. We are very spoiled."
And in contrast to this quote from NYBG, we have a striking finding in this portion of our questionnaire where Queens Botanic Garden and Brooklyn Botanic Garden, when asked this question of what changes they would make to their programming with unlimited funding, they had immediately talked about cost. So Queens Botanic Garden in this quote discusses how they have many programs that they've already planned that they'd love to get off the ground, but they just don't have enough funding for. When they say, you know, we've had ideas for so many programs, we can't get off the ground without some type of funding. We don't have any money that we're kind of just sitting on waiting to do new things. And they go on to say, "I would have much lower costs for programs so that we can get a more wide range of participation. We've talked for years about having more programs for children on the spectrum or other developmental disabilities." And Brooklyn Botanic Garden had said the same thing. They would make their programs free for their participants. And so what we were able to see across all of the institutions was that they provide an immersive and plant-based learning experience. They nurture nature connections. They help to develop long-term stewardship thinking and aid in processing and scientific thinking skills. And all of them value community engagement and environmental education. At the institutions, they all have hands-on learning, a focus on botanic content, focus on teaching rather than measuring, which they see as a weakness. But what we evaluated was this could be a lack of expertise in specifically measuring program efficacies and insufficient resources.
And we've continuously mentioned how NYBG is the largest and best funded institution, so that is reflected in their responses. while the QBG had very striking differences in the same questions, and the New York Botanic Garden and Brooklyn Botanic Garden shared some aspects of their responses.
And so our research did have some limitations. We didn't conduct a full inventory of the environmental education programs of all the institutions. We also had a very limited sample size where we had 3 representatives from New York Botanic Garden, 1 from Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and 1 from Queens Botanic Garden. And when we had overrepresentation at New York Botanic Garden, we had 3 perspectives of environmental educators, but we saw this as broadening that platform for environmental educators, but we do understand that it could have skewed our data towards New York Botanic Garden.
We recommend increasing sample size, improving interview questions, addressing unanswered questions, and including other botanic institutions like Wave Hill and Snug Harbor, and other outside gardens of the United States and within the United States. We've continued on with interviewing Wave Hill and Snug Harbor, but did not include them in this analysis.
So thank you so much for your time. We hope that we've explained to you the importance of botanic institutions in creating stewards, and there's a place that you would support and be aware of. So thank you so much for your time. And we are now ready to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, team. Great project, especially considering I know you had to make a lot of changes due to COVID. So I commend you on that. Do we want to start with David this time?
I'll go second again.
Okay, Jim.
Starting to get offended. No, I'm joking. I always have too much to say. I'm not a big fan of nature held in captivity. That said, a couple of things here. The similarities that you found among these institutions, I'm wondering if you considered why they were similar. Is there a national association of botanical gardens that sets standards, for example, that member institutions are expected to adapt? And is that a factor? A second comment that I think is relevant as well has to do with your analysis. I would be very careful in using the language of overrepresentation, sampling, and the like. What you're doing is not statistical analysis. You're not trying to get a representative sample here. I think your insights and the information that you gathered is quite useful, and I don't think you should discount it by forcing it into that inconvenient space of scientific or statistical inference. Your project doesn't fit within that, within those constraints, and you shouldn't try to make it fit in those constraints. So I'll stop there, but I do wonder if you know about any type of oversight or national or international organization that these botanical gardens belong to, and which sort of mandates the way that they operate.
So I don't think there's any that mandates it, but there is a bigger institution or like umbrella where everyone goes to meet every, I don't know, however many years, and it's held in different parts of the world. So different institutions get to see other institutions, and it's called BGCI, and they actually have some plans that they publish periodically. And I think that the most recent one was from 2011 to 2020. So I guess they're due for a renewal.
And in regards to the second question, I definitely agree that we didn't want to take the information we had and put it into any kind of formed box. And we can definitely change the vocabulary we're using to refer to our data, but that is the reason that we used, we were very heavy in using the quotes to help that come across to our audience and for them to analyze, since we're interpreting it in a certain way, but then we allow those quotes to live and let the audience interpret them as well.
Yeah, and that's very powerful to have the voice of your informants. And one suggestion would be to think of this, to use content analysis, for example, which would allow you to look for themes that are shared among the three institutions, right? So the language is very important. But again, that's a minor quibble. I think what you did is quite informative and quite interesting.
Great, thank you. David?
Hi. The presentation was interesting. I come from the engineering side, and of course, this program is sort of a marriage between engineering, science, and architecture with some work from the social sciences. And usually, in the past, most of the presentations of the projects have had elements of more than one of those schools. And I'm not sure I see an element of engineering, architecture, or science in there, even though I found it interesting. But I'm a little bit of a lack for, something that touches on any of those, like any sort of, for example, there are certain goals you may list, and then it would be interesting to see certain designs or redesigns of parts of a garden to specifically address those goals. So there I would see a design connected to a goal, or some sort of quantification of the success of any of these goals. I've seen goals, but I didn't really hear anything about connecting goals to success. So, with some sort of analysis. Is there any either one of those in here?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting point, and Navita, maybe I'll let you put also your opinion into that too. But for the way that I would answer that question, with those goals and those success measurements being quantitative, what we were seeing in our interviews was this, in order for these botanic gardens to get funding from grants to do the programs they want to do, which we believe are very beneficial, and I think that's where the science is. When I was doing the literature review, and I didn't go into it in depth in our presentation, but seeing the cognitive effects of how nature can be beneficial for children is really, to me, the scientific part of this, and just not emphasized too much in our presentation. But with those program measurements, there's a lot of, I feel a pushback in making these quantitative measurements, because to allow a child to, learn in nature, there definitely needs to be more research, and we have to figure out how can we say that this is helpful or beneficial. And there are ways out there, but there are other narratives and just, there's physiological measurements that we can talk about. But the benefits that we showed was the uniqueness of the gardens measuring program success measurements in things like, if a child can walk away with just one concept, we've done our job. They're enjoying themselves. And there's these things that don't put such an emphasis on quantitative data. And we see these programs as extremely beneficial for children. And to us, it's a barrier that there has to be.
You haven't interviewed the children. How do you know? Yeah. This is what the people who run the gardens are saying. How do we know that it's actually accomplishing what the people who are writing the grant say it is?
So,
I would like to see. I would have liked to have seen.
So we actually, in our table with the traditional methodology versus the alternative methodology, only New York Botanic Garden was able to do the surveying, and we think that's due to the fact that they have so much money. And this is sort of like a first step in showing the benefits of these botanic gardens using the BBG quote, where they recognize this lack of quantification in pushing for more quantification. Like, they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They would love these numbers. They would love to give pre's and posts, and they just can't. They have no money.
But then I would, in a presentation, and I'll finish with this, I would have specific, propose specific methods of doing those measurements.
Okay.
Because to make it somewhat, a little bit less in the air and more with 2 feet on the ground.
So
I'm just gonna chime in here for a second. David, I think you want a project about something else. They were looking to see what botanical education is all about, and I don't think it needs to be quantitative, and that's what they were trying to show. And you're asking for kind of a completely different project, which was not what they were interested in looking at. and it's a completely different project. So
Right. But I'm thinking that that type of project that has a connection to one of either architecture, engineering, or science, which are the departments that sustainability is based in, would be more appropriate.
Well, this sustainability is also based in a social aspect as well, which is where we're in this.
Generally, the projects touch on at least two of the areas: engineering, social, science, or architecture. Usually, they overlap on two.
well, the content that they're learning is science. So